back to another Before You Read lecture. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture on the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, and trying a bit of a new format with the recording, and will hopefully be successful in doing so. As with our previous Before You Read lectures, I want to provide sort of a basic orientation to the writings of Isaiah, and give you a little bit of what we know about Isaiah and his persona, as well as the major message that we find in Isaiah. Now, the place to begin really with the book of Isaiah in terms of orientation is just to point out that, as John Collins has noted in his textbook on the Old Testament, Isaiah is perhaps the most complex book in all of the Old Testament. It is complex for a number of reasons. Chief among those is that there are clues throughout the text of Isaiah, the 66 chapters that make up the book of Isaiah, that pretty clearly come from very different time periods. And if we think just in terms of the major powers that were around and their rise and fall, the neighbors of Israel, we can date parts of Isaiah to these different periods. So there's a lot that deals with Assyria, which would be in the 8th or 7th century BCE. But then, of course, there's also Babylon, and the Babylonian exile looms large, which is some 100 years later. And then finally, there are mentions in several places of King Cyrus of Persia, a figure who was not active and dominant until after the Babylonian exile. And so what scholars have noted is that Isaiah contains material that sort of reaches this whole long period of 200 or 300 years. And so while we know of Isaiah of Jerusalem as a prophet, and we learn about him in 2 Kings 15, and we know that he was active in the 8th century BCE, in the period just before the destruction of Israel in the north, there seems to be writings that are attributed to him or collected in what we now know of as the book of Isaiah that date from a period much later than when Isaiah of Jerusalem lived. And so there is a traditional break among scholars who suggest that the first 39 chapters can be referred to as First Isaiah. And these are the materials most closely associated with Isaiah of Jerusalem, writing in the 8th century, although there are some parts that may be later as well. Then scholars typically will describe Isaiah 40 through chapter 55 as Second Isaiah, and this is material that more or less is dealing with the reality of Babylonian exile. And it's very possible that this was written even from Babylon, from an unknown prophet in Babylon. And then the final section, Isaiah 56 through 66, seems to be written on the other side of exile from a prophet or a group of prophets that were living in Jerusalem. This is a lot of historical data, and it's hard to keep track of, and most of us are used to just reading Isaiah from cover to cover. But this helps us understand some of the differences that emerge, and most scholars would say that the final editors, if you will, did do some work to connect the first, second, and third parts of Isaiah. For this lecture, I'm covering Isaiah 1 through 39. I will talk about 2nd and 3rd Isaiah in another lecture. A few things just about this material from Isaiah 1 through 39 and why it's important and why we might pay attention to it. The first is, again, we know of Isaiah of Jerusalem from 2 Kings chapter 15. We know, for example, of his relationship with King Hezekiah. We learn from Isaiah 1:1 that Isaiah was active in the reign of a number of different kings. Isaiah 1:1 says that he was active in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah, all southern kingdoms or southern kings. And so that tells us that he was beginning to write somewhere around 734 BCE and completed his writing in around 701, or as late as the 688 perhaps is what some scholars suggest. Now the writing of First Isaiah itself, we can break it out a bit if we wanted to, and I think that this can be helpful because one of the things that makes Isaiah so complex is it is really a collection of oracles. And some of these oracles have themes that sort of are interrelated, but some of them don't. And so it can be a little bit disconcerting to read. For an outline, we might say that the first 5 chapters, Isaiah 1 through 5, are really oracles related to Judah, to God's own people. Chapters 6 through 11 directly relate to a historical moment known as the Syro-Ephraimite War. And this is when the North and Ephraim are coming after Jerusalem in war. They've sort of created an alliance and are hoping to go against Jerusalem. And so chapters 6 through 11 are directly dealing with that. Incidentally, in this section, we also learn from chapter 6 about Isaiah, the historical figure of Isaiah. Chapters 12 through 23 are oracles against the nations. And the list is grand of the different nations that are addressed. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. Isaiah 24 through 27 is often described as the apocalypse of Isaiah. And because of the nature of this writing and its topics, many scholars suggest that it actually is one of these sections that date from beyond, from after the Babylonian exile. Chapters 28 through 33 are oracles related to the revolt against Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. Chapters 34 and 35 are, again, similar in style to what we see in the 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. And so some scholars wonder if those are also later materials. And then 36 through 39 consists largely of narrative, of a prose narrative describing Isaiah and his relationship with King Hezekiah, similar to what we see in 2 Kings 15. That's the broad outline of the material. I want to say just a few things about the oracles against the nations, and then we can dig into the themes and message of Isaiah. So the oracles against the nation are, again, run from about Isaiah 12 through 23. And the list of nations that are addressed by the prophet or by God through the prophet is long. It includes Babylon and Assyria, Philistia, Moab, Damascus, Ethiopia, Egypt, Edom, Arabia, and Tyre. And you're welcome to sort of peruse, thumb through these oracles against the nations. And there are some specific charges that God brings against each nation. But I think if we think about them as a whole, there's a couple of really important theological points that they make. The first is that God is shown to be not just the God of Israel in the north or Judah in the south. It no longer is God a tribal God. But God is being presented as the God of the universe, or at least the inhabited world, as the prophet Isaiah knows it. And so it's not just Israel and Judah that are accountable now to God. It is the whole nations. All of the nations are now accountable to God. And I think that this is a really significant move in the Old Testament. In addition, this suggests that Isaiah is moving more towards what we understand as monotheism. Typically, in a polytheistic culture, you sort of, each nation has their own god or collection of gods that they venerate, and it's just understood that, this god does that and that god does that. But what we see with this oracles against the nation is God is actually claiming to be God of Edom. God is claiming to be God of Egypt, or at least that Egypt and Edom are responsible to God. And I think that's an important development, and that the sorts of things that God expects of Israel or of Judah are also being expected of these nations, maybe in a different way. Now, when it comes to themes and the message of First Isaiah, there are a couple of things that really hold together. Although there are these disparate oracles and it can be hard to follow along, there are some things that really hold it together. And so the first that is apparent is the theme of God's judgment. There's an aspect of doom and gloom to Isaiah, if we're being honest. God is speaking through the prophet Isaiah to forewarn the people of Judah about some hard things coming, about God's judgment. And like we saw in Amos and Hosea, part of this judgment is against the cultic system, against sort of showy religion and the neglect of justice. And so we see this word of judgment against unjust practices, against all forms of injustice. But there's also a form of judgment expressed in Isaiah against what I would call is human pride or arrogance. There is this sense in which God is responding to humans who think that they run their own world, they make their own treaties, they live a life of luxury or of comfort, and they begin to think of themselves in exalted ways. And so in some ways a theme of Isaiah is this tension between exaltation, human exaltation, and human humiliation, and the exaltation of God. And so we might read this with an eye for the proper place of human pride and human humility, and what first Isaiah says about that. I think another thing that will become apparent is what is described as Zion theology. Zion is just a word for the temple in Jerusalem or the city of Jerusalem. It's the holy place. And we see in the Psalms all of this language about the importance of Zion or the importance of the temple. And it's not insignificant that Isaiah receives his vision in Isaiah 6 at the temple. And so there is this pronounced interest in Jerusalem and in the king, in the Davidic line. And so there's this, what is known as Zion theology, which runs throughout parts of Isaiah 1 through 39, really focusing on the importance of Jerusalem, the importance of kings in the line of David, and so forth. And so be on the lookout for that. As you read, here's my suggestion in terms of breaking it down. I encourage you to read Isaiah 1 through 12, and then chapters 36 through 39. This, I think, will give you a really good sense of the persona and the message of Isaiah of Jerusalem. Now, you're welcome, as I said before, to read through some of those oracles against the nations in chapters 13 through 23. But I wanted to sort of focus our attention on chapters 1 through 12 and chapters 36 through 39. And as you read, just a couple of things that you might keep an eye on. The first is, again, keep in mind the role of the prophet in all of this. The ways in which Isaiah the prophet is interpreting the political and cultural events around him with an eye for what God might be doing in and through them. So what is Isaiah's role as it relates to the monarchy, as it relates to the temple and the priesthood? And so be aware of that. The second is see what this part of Isaiah says about the ideal king. This is a material that was very popular in early Christianity for thinking through the significance of Jesus. And so as you read it, think about what it says about the ideal king, and be aware of how you've heard these things, particularly around Advent and the celebration of the birth of Christ. And finally, invite you to reflect on this balance between pride and humility as we see in this section of Isaiah. I wonder, these are old texts, but I wonder how they connect with us today in the 21st century. What degree should we hear the words of pride and humiliation in our own contemporary world. I am confident that you will get a lot out of your reading of Isaiah. Hopefully it'll be a book that you want to read more of and go back to. But hopefully this sampling from Isaiah 1 through 12 and chapters 36 through 39 will give you a really good sense of what Isaiah was up to and the contribution that he makes to our biblical canon. Happy reading.